I think that what is really, really important to remember is that first and foremost, the auto industry is victim of the tariffs, of the American tariffs. And Stellantis' decision to move production from Brampton to the US is completely unacceptable. So we're suing Stellantis because basically we had a deal, they broke it, and we want our money back.
Canada has crossed a line it rarely crosses. Ottawa is now suing Stellantis, one of the world's largest automakers, after the company abandoned its production commitment in Brampton. And according to Industry Minister Mélanie Joly, this crisis didn't begin in Canada at all. It began in Washington, with Donald Trump's tariffs blowing apart North America's auto supply chain and pushing companies into decisions that hurt Canadian workers. This is more than a corporate dispute. It is a moment where Canada is openly defending its industrial sovereignty and pushing back against the economic chaos that Trump's trade war has unleashed. The confrontation escalated when Stellantis shifted Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to the United States, cutting roughly 3,500 Canadian jobs. In response, Mélanie Joly made an unusually blunt statement on national television. "We're suing Stellantis because we had a deal. They broke it. We want our money back." That sentence set the tone for Canada's new approach: firm, unapologetic, and very public. The deal Joly refers to involves the multi-billion-dollar Next Star battery project in Windsor, a joint venture between LG Energy Solution and Stellantis. Canada agreed to support the plant with generous incentives, but only if Stellantis upheld its commitment to keep production in Brampton. When the company walked away, Ottawa filed a notice of default, the legal precursor to a full lawsuit. What makes this case even more political is the way Joly framed the cause. She stated plainly, the auto industry is victim of the American tariffs. In her telling, Stellantis didn't suddenly fall out of love with Ontario. The company reacted to the shockwaves coming from Trump's tariff regime, a regime designed to pull manufacturing back into the U.S., even at the expense of America's closest trading partners. The lawsuit marks a turning point in Canada's strategy toward U.S. economic pressure. Trump's 25% auto tariffs, reinstated and expanded when he returned to office, were intended to force companies to shift production into patriotic compliance with American industrial policy. But the outcome has been far messier. Integrated supply chains, especially those connecting Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio, are unraveling under the strain. Reuters and Bloomberg both reported sharp price increases and production declines in the U.S. auto market, along with strong criticism from American auto associations. Canada, meanwhile, is refusing to simply absorb the damage. Joly explained that protecting Canada's auto industry means taking a firm stand. She reminded viewers that the sector supports 125,000 direct jobs and more than 500,000 overall, making it the single most economically significant manufacturing ecosystem in the country. Losing one plant is not just a political embarrassment, it is a threat to the long-term stability of the national economy. She said she would not allow a floodgate of automakers leaving the country. If Stellantis could break its deal without consequences, other companies might follow. That is why the lawsuit matters far beyond Brampton. At the same time, Canada's broader strategy is shifting. The Carney government has grown increasingly skeptical of relying on the United States as the country's dominant economic partner. Ottawa has expanded trade talks with Asia, deepened defense and industrial cooperation with South Korea and Japan, and taken steps to diversify exports of aluminum, steel, and energy. Canada is behaving less like a dependent neighbor and more like a mid-sized power choosing where and how it engages. While Canada is asserting itself, the United States is dealing with its own fallout. Trump's tariffs, which he described as necessary for American prosperity, are now hitting American wallets. New vehicle prices are rising. U.S. automakers are warning of up to 2 million fewer vehicles sold this year. Business groups in Michigan, one of Trump's key political bases, have criticized the tariffs as destabilizing and harmful. Joly seized on this point and stated that Americans now understand tariffs are simply taxes, and the burden is falling on consumers, not foreign governments. The geopolitical layer makes the situation even more complex. At a recent U.S. congressional hearing, some American officials accused Canada and Mexico of becoming potential backdoors for Chinese materials entering the U.S. market. Joly rejected that insinuation and reaffirmed Canada's consistent engagement with U.S. regulators. Her comment reinforced a larger message: Canada is playing by the rules and defending its interests, while the U.S. is projecting suspicion outward to deflect from its own policy failures. Inside Canada, there is also a political dimension. Joly criticized the Conservative opposition for refusing to form a Team Canada front against U.S. pressure. She reminded Canadians that during the NAFTA renegotiations years ago, political unity was essential. The subtext was clear. At a time when Trump is reshaping North American trade with unilateral tariffs, internal division weakens Canada's negotiating position. The lawsuit against Stellantis, therefore, becomes not only an economic tool, but a political message about national unity. And beyond the political theater, there is a deeper shift happening in how Canadians understand their place in the North American economy. For years, there was an assumption that access to the U.S. market was guaranteed, reliable, and stable. But the Trump era has shaken that belief to its core. In community after community, Canadians are beginning to ask whether tying their economic future to American political volatility is still worth the risk. Ottawa's decision to hold Stellantis accountable signals a new confidence, a belief that Canada can and must protect its industries even if Washington disapproves. There is also a growing recognition that Canada's value to the global economy is rising. Critical minerals, battery supply chains, renewable power, artificial intelligence, and clean industrial capacity are sectors where Canada is now attracting international investment. The Stellantis lawsuit fits into that narrative as well. Canada is telling global companies, if you want access to taxpayer support, you must respect the commitments you make. If you break them, there will be consequences. This is not just about Stellantis. It is about setting new rules for how Canada conducts itself in the next decade of industrial policy.
Canada's lawsuit against Stellantis signals a profound shift in how the country navigates economic conflict with the United States. No longer content with polite diplomacy and private negotiations, Ottawa is responding to Trump-era industrial pressure with legal force, public accountability, and a readiness to fight for its own economic future. This is only the beginning. Stellantis may choose to negotiate, restore jobs, or challenge Canada's claims. Trump may escalate tariffs further. Supply chains may tighten or fracture, but one outcome is already clear. Canada is no longer playing defense. It is actively shaping the terms of its economic destiny. The real question now is whether Trump's protectionist agenda can withstand Canada's pushback, or whether the political story he built around bringing auto jobs back to America is already starting to unravel. The next few months will reveal whether this lawsuit becomes a defining case in North American industrial politics.
As Canada hopes for relief on steel and aluminum tariffs, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is reportedly rejecting any possibility of a deal on the auto sector. Lutnick says there will be no free trade deal without tariffs, that Canada should accept being second to the U.S. on autos, and that cars will be assembled in the United States, not in Canada.
In Toronto, a routine trade conference turned into a political earthquake. As Canadian officials gathered to discuss tariffs, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick delivered a message that stunned the room. He ruled out any special deal on the auto sector and made his stance clear: America first, Canada second. Cars, he said, would be built in the United States, not in Canada. That blunt message immediately reached Ontario, the beating heart of Canada's auto industry. Premier Doug Ford fired back, warning that if Washington intended to cripple Canada's steel, aluminum, and auto sectors, Ontario would stop sending even a single ounce of energy south. His tone was fierce, but it reflected a deep frustration that had been building for months. This confrontation was about more than tariffs or car assembly lines. It was about the future of a continent's industrial balance. For years, North America's prosperity has depended on a tightly linked supply chain stretching from Detroit to Windsor, from Ohio to Ontario. The Trump administration's latest push to repatriate auto manufacturing now threatens to unravel that system, and in doing so, it could end up harming the very U.S. industries it claims to protect. Since returning to the White House, President Donald Trump has doubled down on his no free trade without tariff strategy. His team, led by Secretary Lutnick, argues that Canada must accept a subordinate role in North American manufacturing. Under this logic, the U.S. would dominate car production while Canada provides raw materials and components. In Washington's view, this hierarchy is simple economics. The United States is the larger market, with more capital and leverage. But in practice, the two economies are deeply interdependent. Ontario's auto sector alone employs over 100,000 people and supports another 400,000 across supply chains that cross the border daily. Thousands of trucks shuttle parts back and forth, feeding assembly lines that have operated as one integrated ecosystem for decades. By imposing tariffs and discouraging investment in Canadian facilities, Washington hopes to force automakers to relocate production to the U.S. But the reality is more complicated. The components used in an SUV built in Michigan often originate from factories in Ontario and vice versa. If that chain is disrupted, both sides lose efficiency and face higher costs. Trump's team believes tariffs are leverage, yet history shows they often become self-inflicted wounds. The more pressure Washington applies, the more friction it introduces into a system that underpins its own manufacturing base.
I will put legislation in if he wants to destroy our auto sector and destroy our steel sector, and for Quebec, the aluminum sector. There won't be a grain of critical minerals going south of the border. There won't be one ounce of energy coming from Ontario, because you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use that cheap energy that we're selling to our American friends to be competitive to sell products around the world. That's what we're going to do.
Ontario's response came quickly and sharply. Premier Ford's statement about withholding energy and critical minerals was more than political theater. It was a reminder that Canada holds powerful cards of its own. Ontario supplies significant electricity to neighboring U.S. states, and Canada as a whole provides more than half of America's imported energy, from hydroelectric power to oil, natural gas, and uranium. By linking energy to trade, Ford reframed the conversation. He wasn't threatening out of anger, he was signaling that Canada could recalibrate its exports to serve global markets instead of feeding an unbalanced partnership. He emphasized that the same cheap energy currently powering Ontario's factories could make Canadian goods more competitive abroad if the U.S. chose confrontation over cooperation. Within Canada's industrial community, the reaction was equally strong. Business leaders warned that cutting Canada out of North American auto manufacturing would backfire on American companies. Many of the plants at risk are owned by U.S. giants like General Motors and Ford, which have operated profitably in Canada for more than a century. Closing those facilities would mean spending billions to relocate production and losing access to an integrated supply chain that includes Canadian steel, aluminum, and advanced plastics. Meanwhile, labor unions voiced anger that Ottawa seemed to prioritize steel and aluminum relief over autos. For them, the message was clear: the auto sector must remain at the center of any negotiation. Canada cannot trade away its core industries for symbolic wins elsewhere. In this atmosphere, the once predictable rhythm of North American manufacturing is giving way to a new reality. Ontario, long seen as dependent on U.S. trade goodwill, is asserting itself as an indispensable partner, one capable of influencing not just what gets built, but where and how power flows across the continent. While the Trump administration insists its tariffs protect American jobs, the economic math tells a different story. Disrupting trade with Canada carries significant costs for the U.S. economy. Each year, more than $100 billion worth of auto parts and vehicles move between the two countries, according to Statistics Canada and the U.S. Department of Commerce. Roughly 23% of all U.S. vehicle exports are sold to Canadian buyers, a market of 40 million people who purchase about 2 million cars annually. Losing that market would hit U.S. automakers directly, not in theory, but in their quarterly earnings. Analysts at the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association warn that if the U.S. moves production entirely south, costs will rise across the board. Factories in Detroit, Ohio, and Indiana rely on Ontario's steel and components to remain competitive. Tariffs could drive up prices by 10 to 25%, reducing sales and profit margins. And beyond the economics lies a geopolitical cost. Canada supplies the critical minerals, like nickel from Sudbury, that feed America's defense and battery industries. Restricting cooperation risks slowing down both nations' transition to cleaner technologies. If Washington ignores this reality, its own automakers could face declining output, shrinking market share, and backlash from consumers who see higher prices and fewer options. In essence, Trump's attempt to dominate North American manufacturing could isolate U.S. producers in their own market. What began as a power play could become a policy backfire. The confrontation between Ontario and Washington is more than a trade dispute. It's a test of how far economic nationalism can go before it turns inward. By insisting that every car be built on American soil, the Trump administration risks dismantling a supply network that has made North American manufacturing globally competitive. And as Ontario flexes its leverage over energy, minerals, and market access, it becomes clear that no country can dictate terms in a system built on shared prosperity. In trying to make America stronger, Trump's tariffs may instead weaken its industrial foundation. Canada has not caved. Its leaders have shown that partnership is not submission, and cooperation is not weakness. The message from Toronto to Washington is unmistakable. Pressure may win headlines, but interdependence still drives the continent's strength. North America was built on integration, not isolation. And as this new round of tariff battles unfolds, one truth stands out. When one side tries to win everything, both sides start to lose.
Governor Scott was very clear on his messaging about the impacts of tariffs on Canada and the U.S. He's totally against the tariffs. He's a Republican who actually voted against the tariffs, and he stands firm that tariffs are not something that we should be talking about between friends. He was almost apologetic.
Yeah, a lot of that.
For the tariffs that are being imposed on Canada at the time.
Canada has just experienced one of the most unexpected moments of this entire U.S.-Canada trade war. A Republican governor openly apologizing to Canada for Donald Trump's tariffs. Not a Democrat, not an independent, a sitting Republican governor. And he didn't sugarcoat it. He said the tariffs were wrong, damaging, and hurting Americans more than Canadians. At the exact same time, Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing a major new support package for softwood lumber and steel, two industries Trump has deliberately targeted. The timing is not an accident. Canada is building a stronger national economic shield just as Trump's tariff strategy begins to crack from within the United States. This moment says something bigger. The U.S. is starting to fracture under Trump's own policies, and Canada is stepping into a position of unity and strength. The turning point came during a joint gathering of Atlantic premiers and New England governors. Vermont Governor Phil Scott, a well-known Republican, told Canadian leaders that he was strongly opposed to Trump's tariffs and was, in his own words, almost apologetic for what Washington was doing. For a governor from Trump's own party to say that publicly is extraordinary. Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Tony Wake then revealed that the premiers had discussed the entire tariff situation directly with Prime Minister Carney. According to Wake, Carney confirmed that Ottawa is preparing a significant package for softwood lumber and steel, two sectors Trump has repeatedly hit with tariffs throughout 2025. Wake explained that Carney also committed to more frequent meetings with all premiers, something Canada hasn't seen in years, signaling a coordinated national response.
Meanwhile, the economic backdrop continues to shift. Trump has pushed U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods outside USMCA up to around 35%, creating serious strain on tourism, retail, and energy-adjacent states that rely heavily on Canadian visitors and cross-border trade. Statistics Canada recently showed a sharp decline in Canadian travel to the U.S., leaving border towns in northern New England struggling. That is the real reason Phil Scott apologized. His state is taking the hit. Behind the scenes, Carney is juggling several fronts at once. Canada's federal budget already includes industrial tax credits, nation-building infrastructure, and the new Major Projects Office aimed at speeding up mega-projects across the country. Now, a tailored program for steel and lumber appears to be next. Reuters and CBC reporting confirm that Carney is moving in that direction, and the premiers seem fully aligned with him. Trump's second-term trade agenda was built on the belief that Canada would eventually give in simply because of its proximity and economic ties to the U.S. The logic was simple. Hit Canada hard enough, and the pressure will eventually force concessions. But that assumption no longer fits reality. Canada has spent the entire year diversifying its trade, especially towards Asia and Europe. The Reuters numbers are clear. Canadian exports to the U.S., while still significant, have fallen as Canadian companies move aggressively to new markets. That shift alone weakens Trump's leverage. At the same time, the U.S. is dealing with the consequences of its own actions. American refiners still rely on Canadian heavy crude, American home builders still depend on Canadian lumber, and U.S. manufacturers still need Canadian steel and key minerals. When Trump disrupts those supply chains, Americans, not Canadians, absorb most of the damage. That is why Phil Scott apologized. He wasn't being diplomatic, he was acknowledging reality. Vermont's tourism is collapsing. Maine, New Hampshire, and upstate New York are facing similar pressures. Americans are feeling the impact of Trump's tariffs in ways they did not expect, and Republican governors are reaching their limit.
This is where the political landscape becomes fascinating. A Republican governor siding with Canada over the Republican president is not normal. It signals an emerging split within the GOP, one where local economic survival matters more than party loyalty. For Canada, this is powerful leverage. When U.S. states begin pushing back against Washington, Canada suddenly has partners south of the border who can influence national policy from the inside. It creates a dynamic where Canada isn't fighting the United States. It's working with the parts of the United States that disagree with Trump. These states want Canadian tariffs back. They want cross-border trade restored. They want stable, predictable commercial ties. And they're saying so openly. And while Washington drifts into division, Ottawa is sharpening its focus, moving ahead with a plan that hits back where Trump aimed the hardest.
We talked about the budget, which was positive, an announcement on steel and softwood lumber that affects Ontario in a big way. He'll be addressing that over the next week or so.
Carney's upcoming package for lumber and steel is more than just economic support. It is a political message. It says that Canada will not be cornered, and it will not allow domestic industries to collapse because of Washington's political theater. Softwood lumber has been a target in nearly every U.S.-Canada dispute for 20 years. Steel and aluminum were brought back under national security language that even American officials admitted was flimsy. Trump revived those tools again in 2025, expecting Canada to complain but ultimately comply. Carney's approach is different. Rather than waiting for Washington to soften, Ottawa is stabilizing the entire supply chain at home. The federal budget's industrial incentives already give manufacturers new breathing room. The super deduction for productivity lets mills and smelters modernize at a discount. And with this new package, Carney is effectively drawing a line. Canadian workers and industries will be protected, with or without American cooperation. This is the clearest sign so far that Canada is preparing for long-term tension with Washington and is willing to rebuild its own industrial base to withstand it.
One of the most important details from Wake's interview was how committed Carney is to keeping premiers directly involved. For years, Canada's internal coordination was fragmented. Provinces often acted independently, reacting to U.S. policy on their own. Now under Carney, Canada is acting as a single strategic unit. Atlantic Canada is pushing for fisheries protection and energy development. Ontario is laser-focused on steel and manufacturing. British Columbia wants stability in softwood lumber. Quebec is renegotiating hydro deals. The prairies are adapting to global agriculture. Carney's message throughout these meetings has been consistent. Canada must stand united while the U.S. is divided. That unity is becoming a competitive advantage.
A Republican governor apologized to Canada. The Atlantic premiers stood behind the Prime Minister, and a major steel and softwood package is about to land on the national stage. All of this is happening as Trump's tariff war falters under its own economic weight. Canada isn't bowing. Canada isn't breaking. Canada is building. And the real question going forward is simple. If U.S. states are already rebelling against Trump's strategy, how long can Washington hold the line before its own economy forces a retreat? That's the story every North American leader will be watching in the months ahead.
Right, both Canada and Mexico want to save North America-wide free trade, but they both know that they can't control what the U.S. does. Now both countries face the renegotiation of the CUSMA Free Trade Agreement next year, so this is a chance to coordinate their negotiating positions and strategies.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has just returned from Mexico City, where he met President Claudia Sheinbaum. The images of the two leaders side by side are more than routine diplomacy. They mark a deliberate attempt to reset a relationship that for years drifted in what analysts call benign neglect. Tensions had even flared when Canadian provincial leaders suggested Mexico was undercutting Canadian workers. For Mexico, that was a slight not easily forgotten. Carney's trip was about repairing that trust, but also about something larger. At a time when the United States under Donald Trump is leaning inward and destabilizing trade with aggressive tariffs, Canada is searching for partners who can help balance the risks. The question is whether this outreach to Mexico can provide a stronger foundation as North America heads toward another round of negotiations. History shows why this matters. During the last difficult NAFTA negotiations, Mexico quietly shared information with Canadian officials that allowed Ottawa to prepare responses when Trump tried to corner them. That cooperation allowed Canada to secure fairer terms on steel and aluminum tariffs. Fast forward to today, and the playing field looks different. Mexico has been granted a 90-day reprieve on Trump's new reciprocal tariffs. The relief covers cars, steel, aluminum, and copper. Canada did not receive the same treatment. It is a classic divide-and-conquer strategy from Washington, one designed to split partners and test their resolve. Carney's mission in Mexico was therefore not just symbolic. He needed to show that despite past friction, Canada and Mexico can still act as allies when facing the weight of U.S. tariffs.
The talks, however, were not a one-way street. Mexican leaders emphasized that Canadian mining companies must respect strict environmental rules if they want to keep investing. This reminder speaks to long-standing disputes about the impact of Canadian mining operations abroad. Beyond that, Mexico is eager to grow trade flows in both directions and attract more Canadian capital. Both sides are also preparing detailed evaluations ahead of the 2026 review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. That review will determine whether the pact that replaced NAFTA continues in its current form or evolves into something broader. Here lies a key opportunity. Canada and Mexico are both members of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. That membership allows them to coordinate on exports to Asia-Pacific markets, something the United States cannot do. By pooling production capacity and leveraging trade access beyond North America, the two countries could increase competitiveness at a moment when global supply chains are being reshaped.
The contrast across the continent is striking. In the United States, the economy is showing signs of strain. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the unemployment rate climbed to 4.3% in August 2025, the highest since 2021. On September 17, the Federal Reserve cut its benchmark interest rate to a range of 4 to 4.25%, citing a weakening labor market. Economists warn that a combination of slower job growth and persistent tariff costs could tip the U.S. towards stagflation. Canada faces challenges of its own. Statistics Canada reported the GDP contracted by 1.5% in the second quarter of 2025, and unemployment reached 7.1% in August. Yet Ottawa is pursuing a different strategy. Carney is betting that by tightening economic ties with Europe and Mexico, Canada can diversify trade, reduce vulnerability, and attract new investment. The takeaway is clear. The United States is wrestling with policy uncertainty and the risk of recession, while Canada is trying to build resilience through diplomacy. Carney's meetings in Mexico City were not simply photo opportunities. They were part of a calculated effort to secure allies before the difficult USMCA review begins in 2026. Whether this approach succeeds will depend on how much Canada and Mexico can align their interests. But in a time of volatility, even modest steps toward cooperation may give Canada a stronger footing in North America's shifting landscape.